Let's talk about social media today and this debate we've talked about that's been taking place about whether big social media companies like Twitter and YouTube and Facebook should be regulated by the government to prevent what some are calling censorship. We're probably all familiar with this phenomenon of social media companies temporarily or sometimes permanently banning creators on their platforms for violating terms of service. And especially after the recent ordeal with Alex Jones and the backlash that followed, there has been a lot more focus on this issue. And in fact, there was sort of a national discussion, which is still taking place, about number one, should First Amendment free speech privileges extend to major social media platforms owned by private companies? If so, at what point are the companies big enough, the platforms big enough where that should be the case? How much power should these platforms have to deplatform individuals like Alex Jones? Does the government have a responsibility to step in and prevent what some are considering dangerous censorship? And the Alex Jones incident specifically prompted the Justice Department to actually look into this and to start an investigation into supposed censorship and political bias by these social media companies. Social media executives have been questioned at Senate hearings about this, and there's a certain contingent of the public that is sort of in favor of government intervention to enforce free speech on major social media platforms, whatever that means, and we'll talk about that. Even President Trump weighed in where he said, quote, "Social media is totally discriminating against Republican conservative voices. Speaking loudly and clearly for the Trump administration, we won't let that happen. They are closing down the opinions of many people on the right, while at the same time doing nothing to others. Censorship is a very dangerous thing and absolutely impossible to police. If you are weeding out fake news, there is nothing so fake as CNN and MSNBC, and yet I do not ask that their sick behavior be removed." Social media platforms should be audited and regulated when it comes to preventing foreign influence in American political elections and affairs, particularly because much of it would just simply entail better enforcement of already existing laws that are designed to protect the democratic processes in the United States. So there's actually no reason for any controversy there, although it's not clear that the Trump administration is actually really concerned about that, at least not that we've seen. But as I've said in previous segments, I am not in favor of having the government force privately owned social media companies to publish the content of people that they don't want to be associated with, even if it's supposedly in the name of free speech. It's a knee-jerk reaction to a problem that I don't even really think exists. No one can honestly say that these platforms, like YouTube, for example, aren't accommodating right-wing voices. That's one of the most ridiculous aspects of all of this, which is how fabricated all of this social media free speech outrage is. Both left and right-wing channels have been affected by YouTube demonetization, including our channel. Some have tried to argue that YouTube is overrun or completely dominated by right-wing channels. I don't agree with all of those claims because progressives do have a strong presence. But the right is also not having trouble on YouTube. And you might even be able to say that YouTube is the home of the millennial conservative movement. Almost all of the right-wing or anti-PC personalities who are popular among millennials owe their fame in great part to YouTube. Steven Crowder, more than 2.5 million subscribers. Jordan Peterson, 1.5 million subscribers. The Daily Wire has about 1 million. Rebel Media, Rubin Report, Milo Yiannopoulos has a strong presence. Stefan Molyneux, Lauren Southern, Blair White, Gavin McInnes, even alt-right white nationalists like Jared Taylor and others do really well on YouTube. And you might say, well, hold on a second. Some of those people have been banned or they've been suspended on Twitter, and I think that was unfair. But the thing is that plenty of people further to the left or in the middle or with no political affiliation get banned all the time, and often for no good reason. And Twitter has also received a ton of criticism for not being vigilant enough about neo-Nazis and other right-wing extremists on the platform, as has YouTube. So I think a lot of these deplatforming processes are just inefficient or admittedly too opaque, but there is simply not enough evidence that the most popular social media platforms are making it difficult for conservatives to broadcast their message just on the basis of their being conservative. So now that we've identified what the problem is and is not, what is the solution? Number one, the inconsistency and non-transparency with regard to the deplatforming by social media companies is the real problem. It's not the fact that they're able to choose whose content not to publish. I have no problem with that because that is their right. Who they block, how they do it, and why, that's up to them. Instead of trying to solve this false dichotomy of who should control speech, Silicon Valley or the government, we should be asking ourselves, how can we preserve private companies' First Amendment rights, but shift the decision-making power back to the hands of the people? And the answer is for social media companies to establish platform policies that are more clearly defined and more even-handedly enforced. Vague and briefly described rules about hate speech or defamation or offensive content or whatever leave the creator not knowing where the line is, and it leaves the public not knowing whether the company was being impartial when making a decision to deplatform somebody like Alex Jones. And maybe some sort of public statement about why someone was banned and a description of the process should be offered if the deplatformed person had more than a certain amount of engagement or followers on the platform. We don't get anything close to that most of the time with the majority of these platforms, and it would renew some of that lost trust, or at least create some transparency where the public is able to judge for themselves, is the platform banning people in a way that is consistent with its own guidelines, and how are they applying those guidelines in practice? Why would social media companies do this, you might be asking? That's a good question. How do we actually make it happen? We have to demand it of them, right? Undoubtedly, these companies will have to become more transparent and accountable about algorithms and flagging and suspending accounts if it is something that will affect their image and their brand in a way that has an impact, right? Failing to do so, if it makes them less competitive against other social media platforms, will force them inevitably to come along and offer a solution to the problem that we've identified here. The first battle for the social media market was about functionality and addictiveness, and services like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and YouTube, they won that battle, right? But many have said that as we become more pessimistic about social media companies, what they do with our data, how they handle things like deplatforming, that finding solutions to those types of issues will actually become the next battle for gaining and retaining users, and that there will ultimately be some winners and losers. We think of something like Facebook as this sort of eternal monolith, but they've been having some pretty serious PR issues over the last couple of years, especially the last 6 months, and that comes with real financial consequences for the company. I don't think individual social media platforms are as immortal as some make them out to be. Remember what happened to MySpace. Look at the downfall of Tumblr, for example, although it's still around. Twitter and Facebook themselves have been having issues in terms of user numbers, especially lately, and it's been affecting their stock prices as well. Social media is in its infancy, and we can be certain that Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube are not the indefinite be-all, end-all of online communities. More are going to come and go, and here's the ultimate irony with all of this about regulating social media censorship. And I've talked about this before, and you knew I was going to talk about it today. It's usually the right that's determined to preserve the free expression of private corporations. And when it comes to anything else like environmental protection, consumer protection, workers' rights, stabilizing the economy, it's the right who always says the free market is going to work everything out. There's a natural incentive there. It doesn't matter how big or powerful the companies become. There will be free market pressures that will force them to ultimately do the right thing. We don't need to worry about it. We don't need to regulate it. Are right-wingers now arguing that, oh, certain energy companies have become so dominant that we have to ensure that they adhere to their responsibility to the public to mitigate environmental harm? The way they are saying Facebook has a responsibility to the public is nothing they are willing to say when it comes to energy companies, financial companies, or any others. It's only when the right perceives that their group, their side, their tribe is getting the short end of the stick, do they all of a sudden want to impinge on that free market, and they choose to be outraged. It's sort of like when right-wing commenters or right-wingers on the internet talk about how there's this big conspiracy in Hollywood to promote a progressive agenda, to be totally realistic. The corporations that control Hollywood don't care about anything but making money. And Hollywood makes money by taking the temperature of the country and giving consumers what they want, whether it's TV or movies or music or video games. These occupy people's attention as much as social media, and it's about making money ultimately. Are we also going to regulate the messages of those industries the way right-wingers are saying we should regulate social media? I'm not hearing that. What about the advertising industry, like Nike and Colin Kaepernick? It's only about making calculated financial decisions to improve the company's bottom line. It's not about political propaganda for its own sake. And it's the same thing with social media companies. Facebook and YouTube didn't ban Alex Jones to push a progressive political agenda. They banned Alex Jones because their brands were suffering when they were seen as mouthpieces for an unhinged conspiracy theorist, one who they also considered, by the way, to have violated their terms of service, which is granted something they could have done a better job about spelling out, like I said. But Facebook and Twitter are not responsible for the free speech of others. You were responsible for finding a platform on which to speak. You are responsible for finding content you want to consume. And the internet makes it really easy. There are even a lot of new apps and websites that let you consolidate all your social media feeds into one. And those types of services are making this free speech controversy even more moot. And we really shouldn't forget in the end that mainstream corporate media companies like Fox News, who are really pushing this whole social media free speech regulation agenda, are doing so out of their own interests as well, which is something that's often not considered in the debate. It's sort of like when the Wall Street Journal and CNN write articles about YouTube and advertisers, because any new regulation or roadblocks for new media are a win for them. And government regulation of free speech may not be as neutral as many think that it would be. You would have enforcement that could change with administrations and congressional majorities. One proposal has been to form a commission similar to the FCC, where officers are appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. And conservatives should be just as afraid of that idea as progressives, because the entire thing would be a big mess, subject to the whims of whoever's in the White House and controls the Senate. The entire internet itself as a whole is a shared resource and a public square, which, yes, should be kept free and open and equitably available to the public with the help of government, but not the privately owned platforms that operate within it. There isn't enough justification to encroach on the rights of those businesses to make their own decisions on behalf of their shareholders. There are definitely problems right now with how some of these social media platforms handle reprimands and consequences. But the government coming in and imposing harsh control of tech companies to enforce this sort of amorphous, unspecified version of political neutrality would be very sloppy, it would be hasty, and it would be an absolutist response. And importantly, it would be one that is ironic when coming from mostly small government conservatives, as they describe themselves. The current situation, as imperfect as it may be, is actually more tenable than what many are proposing in terms of broad, aggressive, anti-censorship enforcement. And I think that a free market alternative should be our first line of defense. And after all, isn't that what conservatives have been calling for all along in every other industry?